Hello and welcome to 7 advanced tips for every Venti main. I'm so excited for this video. I thought I was not gonna find much for a character so old, but boy, I was wrong. Let's start right away. I wanna show you the combos that I found first. We start with the easy ones that you should always use. Venti takes little on-field time in usual gameplay. Switching to him for his burst should always be after casting his very low cooldown skill. This can be cancelled by the burst itself, like this. And it's easy stuff. Now let's go deeper. Let's say you don't have your burst and you only want to cast your skill. The skill can actually be interrupted by dashing and jumping, but those take longer and do no damage. So how about cancelling with a normal attack? We get a free N1 and actually switch even faster than usual, saving us a few frames. Let's go even deeper though. How much can we really cancel the skill? Now this is getting into useless knowledge territory, but look at this. Using Venti skill immediately after shooting a charge attack will basically skip the skill animation altogether. Okay, but now we're using a charge attack to do that, so it's probably not worth the time, right? How about we also cancel the charge attack? Look at this. Honestly, this was really fun to experiment with, but again, you're only using the skill into burst and switch combos, and this stuff is more of a flex and I guess something useful for those of you who will try on-field DPS builds. It's also fairly hard to perform consistently. Let's move on. His bursts can be confusing at times. Let's understand where all these numbers are coming from. His burst can generate 3 different instances of damage: Anemo, Elemental from the infused element, and Swirl. The Anemo part has 20 instances of damage, they scale from your attack, crit and damage multipliers. The Elemental part has maximum 16 instances of damage, depending on how fast you infuse the new element. They also scale from attack, crit and damage multipliers. And lastly, the Swirl part has around 7 swirls, and they scale off Elemental Mastery and character level alone. There are 2 main ways to build your Venti: full Elemental Mastery or ADC, which is attack, damage and crit. As a recommendation, I generally just go for full Elemental Mastery as it's cheaper, it's very strong in AoE, which is where you want to use a character like Venti anyway, and saves you from the pain of having to farm a crit build for your Viridescent Veneer, because you're not letting go of that set. It also does not need high talent level to perform well. Crit builds, however, can outperform this if done very well or in particular teams or against single targets. Going for hybrid builds can be fine too. He will always perform well as long as he's bringing his VV, crowd control and energy restoration mechanic. Let's use a Venti video to showcase something particular that not many people know about, and that is the interaction between Anemo and Hydro. This will be easier to explain with an example. So if you have 2 enemies close to each other and one is affected by, let's say, Pyro, swirling Pyro will deal 1 instance of Anemo damage, 1 of Pyro damage, the Swirl, and another 1 of Pyro damage, still the Swirl, to the other enemy. And of course, that's because Swirl spreads the element and that's how Swirl works. But in the same scenario, if we have Hydro, the second enemy will only be affected by the element and not take any damage. Hydro swirls do not do AoE damage. It can be important when deciding on how to build and play him, but usually it's not that big of a deal, especially in Electro Charge comps, because infusion aside, you will still swirl Electro and reapply Hydro means sustaining the reaction and getting lots of extra swirls in. And one last thing to keep in mind when min-maxing your damage is that the priority of his infusion is Pyro, into Hydro, into Electro, into Cryo. A lot of people have trouble casting his burst at times. The key for successful cast is spacing and understanding enemy priority. There are 2 main ways to position yourself for his burst. One way is to cast it near the opponent and then kite the opponent into it. This can be very random or not doable at all, so I'd usually not recommend it unless it's against small enemies that will eventually be sucked by the burst anyway. And another way is spacing yourself during any downtime of the enemy or while it's spawning. Making so the burst lands on the enemy will need about this distance. Let's now briefly talk about the ultimate debate. Why is Venti so underlooked and is he really a worse version of Kazu or even Sucrose? First of all, the first big difference between their Ascension passives is that Kazu gives elemental damage, Sucrose gives you elemental mastery and Venti gives you energy back. Venti has the best pulling and grouping out of the 3, but it needs more positioning than Kazu and heavily depends on the enemy's sides, if they are staggered, frozen, etc. Sucrose doesn't really compare to other 2 in that sense, but she has good constellations, she's a 4-star and she can arguably be the best out of the 3 in the right scenario. Unfortunately, Venti comes short of some synergies as well, most namely Cleese Bomb's pull and similar summons, but he is an insane damage dealer when his full kit is at work. He can pull enemies together and play off reactions or AoE talents from other party members. In short, usually Kazu is the preferred unit because of how widely available he is and how nice it is to buff elemental damage. While Venti is unfortunately just better in the rare scenarios, but in those rare scenarios Kazu would still do an amazing job. This kinda brings us to the next tip, which is a reminder that Venti bursts can lift enemies out of reach of skills and bursts. A few examples are bursts like Shanling, Jin, Keiya, skills like Yunjin, Tignari, Kuki, Keiya, or part of Xiao, Ayato, Hutao, and Ayaka's attack patterns. Some will be more consistent and some will randomly miss or hit depending on your exact position. There is a lot to consider when building a Venti team. I just named a few, but you can find a link in the description for a full list of talents that can hit and enemies that can be pulled or lifted by Venti's burst. It's been maintained by Venti's mains Discord, so props to them. The last tip has to be regarded in great synergy of Venti with Quadratic Scaling talents, most notably Ganyu and Ayato's burst. Let's take Ganyu burst as an example. Quadratic Scaling in this context means that the damage scales with the number of enemies, because each icicle that she spawns has its own AoE. If you hit 2 enemies, you will do 4 times the damage, or if you hit 4 enemies, you will do 16 times the damage. As the burst is divided into groups of 5 icicles, it's technically quadratic up to 5 enemies, then linear for 6 or more enemies, like most AoEs and skills. This property is crucial for Ganyu's success and damage, as it highly depends on the amount of enemies you're facing and on their hitbox and sides. This is where the great synergy of Venti and Ganyu was born and their famous Morgana team, which is of course also very dependent on Mona. And that was all. If you're going to pull for Venti, I wish you the best of luck. I already have mine and will do further testing and gameplay over twitch.tv/7even please. I would love for you to join me. I'm live every day in the EU afternoon, Asia evenings and America's morning. Have a good one and goodbye.